So Brent, there is the tendency within higher education to see ourselves as truly distinctive, truly unique as an organizational type.
Mhm.
And in many ways, as we've discussed, that's pretty accurate. At the same time, the tendency to engage in this way of thinking potentially can blind us from learning about the similarities with other kinds of sectors. Can you talk a little bit about, your work in this area and how that might be
Sure.
helpful to this thinking?
Sure. So I think, as you said, in many ways, we are unique and we think of ourselves as being unique. We alluded to the fact that we have multiple constituencies, stakeholders that we have to deal with. We have some core values which make us unique as an institution. The commitment to helping people prepare for a better life, prepare to contribute to a democratic society, prepare for jobs. That's a unique function of our group. We have kind of a commitment to shared decision making and shared governance. So all those things make us rather unique. And I think people who work in higher ed often came to that work thinking it was kind of a special calling even, or a very special kind of work to do. And that's all true. The only thing is that you can also overemphasize or overplay the uniqueness of what we do to the point where you don't see any commonality with any other sectors or any other kind of organizations. And so if you take those characteristics I mentioned, like the number of constituents, the complexity of the environment, the shared decision making, well, certainly government is a sector where all of those same issues come into play. And we see the challenges that play themselves out there as well. And maybe they should look to us to get some ideas about how to do that a little bit better. I don't know. But I think the point is that you see some of that complexity for sure in government. You see some of the same complexity in healthcare organizations, multiple constituencies, professional individuals working there in all different kinds of roles. So I think, as you said, that there are uniquenesses, but there is a danger in overemphasizing those to the point where you think that as a leader you can't really learn anything from other organizations, when in fact it's very clear that you can. And I could give a couple of examples maybe to make the point. So whether it's some support process, like let's even say something like processing travel expense reimbursements. Every organization does that, and some do it better than others. And if you look, universities have not led the way in being efficient in those kinds of ways. But you can look to business world where they have led the way in those ways. And if you try to understand how they've approached sort of support processes like that, how they do them well, so we can add those efficiencies into what we do. You can also take something that's more critical to our core mission, something like research and development. So we think of that as unique to higher ed, but of course it's not. Pharmaceutical companies are engaged in that. Technology companies are engaged in that, and oftentimes they have ways of doing that, which we could learn a great deal from. So there is a downside in overemphasizing the uniqueness that we have. It limits our ability to learn from others.
Yeah. So that the ways in which we learn from others is a really critical leadership takeaway as we think about this. I've been really struck by the work that you did around leadership competencies and in trying to categorize the wide array of leadership perspectives that are out there. And I'm wondering if there's some connection that could be made between your work on leadership competencies and this uniqueness dilemma.
I think there is. And, through the work I've done, kind of looking at the literature and also looking at current practice in leadership, identified really 5 different areas of competency that seem to be talked about as important to leadership. And one of those really is somewhat unique to the particular sector, so we call positional competencies. So whatever different sector you happen to be in, there are things you need to know about that sector. You need education that's appropriate to that sector, you need work experience that's appropriate to that sector, and so on and so on. But then there are 4 other areas which aren't unique to the particular sector you're in, but rather are cross-cutting competencies, which I don't care which organization or which sector you're in, you need to be skilled in these and understand these as well. And so those areas are communication competence, and we've talked some about what we mean by that, but basically it's learning to listen and observe and deal effectively in interpersonal, intercultural, group organizational settings. That's critical. Organizational competencies, being able to establish a vision, build consensus around the vision, manage things effectively, that's critical in any kind of organization, in any sector. Another one that's very critical is analytic competencies, right? And the ability to kind of learn about who you are, about your own biases and skills as a leader, your own strengths, and bring those to bear. Again, that expertise is important in any area that you're going to work in.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful, and we talk about this a little bit later in one of the modules, and you give this a language of vertical competencies, such as those that really dive deep into the specific sector and the needs of leadership within a given position or organization, and then the wide array of horizontal competencies that extend across sectors. So as we think more about higher education as distinctive, in many ways it is, and having an understanding of those vertical orientations matter, but then also being able to learn from what's happening across, as you suggest, from travel expense systems or research and development across sectors, learning more about what's happening across and the wide array of horizontal competencies becomes really critical. I think we all would agree that the communication piece sort of cuts at the core of this, and maybe those communication competencies should be made most prominent in the kinds of ways in which we understand leadership in higher ed. But what's really interesting to consider here is how these competencies in the model that you've introduced, Brent, is really instructive for understanding leadership in higher education. But I know, Chris, the kind of teaching that you've done and the ways in which you've used this inside of the classroom, it can be applied to any other kind of organizational sector, correct?
Yes, definitely. We use Brent's framework in the course that I teach to understand all of the different leadership competencies, but we also think about how these come to play in the digital context, right? So how might a person strengthen their analytic competencies in the digital context? So we talk about listening to stakeholders online or soliciting feedback from stakeholders online. It's a really great framework for breaking down the complexities involved with leadership so people can understand.
And so much of leadership communication now is occurring online in mediated contexts, email, chat rooms, and so on. I think it's just absolutely essential that leaders develop an understanding of how mediation affects what they're doing and how they can apply the knowledge and skill there, whatever the goals and problems that they're addressing.
Yeah.
So all of this, I think, really speaks to the challenges facing leaders in higher education and being able to read multiple literatures and engage with multiple stakeholders as we better understand our own unique challenges and issues, and then most certainly to be able to sort of tap into and learn from what's happening across sectors becomes increasingly more critical, especially as our ecosystem becomes increasingly interconnected, right, through technology and through social interactions more broadly.
There's another dimension of this which I think is important, perhaps not relating directly to any one of the competencies, but just more generally to the transition that you need to go through when you move from a staff member or faculty member to a leadership role. It's such a fundamental change, I think, that it's easy to overlook what some of those factors involved. You know, you go from a situation where you can talk to whoever you want within the unit. You can have as best friend whoever you want within the unit. You don't have to really worry about equal time for different people. You don't have to worry about setting precedents by ideas you express. All that changes when you move into a leadership role. People are looking at you differently. They're looking at you, how are you treating this person versus how are you treating me? They're looking at every decision you make as a precedent-setting decision. And I think maybe even most fundamentally, that shift means going from always feeling comfortable voicing your own personal opinion to seeing yourself now as a representative of the unit and of the institution. And so I know, speaking from a faculty background, faculty members are trained, you know, on having an opinion. In fact, they have an opinion about possibly everything, okay? And they're very willing to share those opinions in a candid kind of way, and we're trained to defend those positions and so on. Many professional staff similarly. But when you're in a leadership role representing your unit, it's a bit of a different problem. You know, you've got to be very careful about keeping your own personal perspective sort of in the background many times, and your role is now to facilitate a team of people sharing their views. And it's not just about your view, it's about the collaborative input of a number of people. And that's a hard transition to understand and even harder to implement.
Right, yeah, it certainly calls for quite a radical paradigm shift in how we understand our own roles. And I know you've actually used the language of the transition from being a solo air pilot, right, where you're in charge of your own aircraft, to one of being the air traffic controller, where the responsibilities are made more complex, but the scope by which you understand them also becomes increasingly enlarged by it as well.
Absolutely, and we've talked a lot, the three of us, about the shift is one of becoming much more reflective about your goals in any situation, kind of debriefing yourself after that situation, whether it's a meeting or an interaction to assess the extent to which your goals were achieved, figuring out how you would do a better job next time. While it would be good to do those things all the time as a faculty or staff member, I think it's essential to do those things when you become a leader.